Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Meg. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the slides okay and hear me all right. Okay, brilliant. So afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along to my talk today. So my name's Chloe and I'm a senior lecturer in English language and literature here at Aston. And like Meg, I'm a stylistician, which means I'm interested in the interface between language and literature. And I use linguistic frameworks for the analysis of literary interpretation and reading experience within my teaching and research. So I guess, yeah, stylistics is the topic of today's two talks. So in the next 20 minutes or so, roughly, I'll give a kind of whistle-stop tour of what is quite a big topic in literary linguistic and narratology studies, and that is point of view. So point of view is one of those huge umbrella terms that subsumes a number of different frameworks and approaches. And so I guess in this paper, I won't be scratching the surface of all of those, but I will try to give an overview of how to approach point of view analyses. So hang on, it's just frozen, which is not helpful. Bear with me while I get it working again. There we go, fab. Okay, so today then I'll be carrying out some example language or rather stylistic analyses of 3 extracts from 3 texts across the course of the paper. And these are A Room with a View, Persuasion and Atonement. So hopefully these mini case studies will give you an idea of the kinds of things you can explore in a stylistic point of view analysis, either through isolating 1 or 2 particular language choices or through taking an approach that's a bit more holistic and that maybe combines some of those ideas that I'm about to introduce. By the way, just to mention this point as well, I would be more than happy to share a copy of these slides if anyone is interested in stealing the extracts. So just drop me an email if you would like a copy of them. First then, some brief context on what point of view actually is. So broadly speaking, we can say that point of view in fiction refers to the angle from which a story is told. A point of view analysis covers quite a few different dimensions, ranging from the physical to the more conceptual. So we can talk about point of view in terms of space and time, and at the same time, we can also refer to someone's psychological or their ideological point of view. And this breadth of dimensions can be seen if we return to that brief working definition that I put on the slide. So the word angle confers both space, but it also has a cognitive or a psychological aspect to it as well. The stylistician Paul Simpson argues that a really good way of approaching point of view in fiction is to imagine that you are filming the scene that you are reading. To help us with this camera work, when we carry out a language analysis of point of view, we can consider questions of reader positioning through vantage point, subjectivity of voice, and of course, questions about reliability and unreliability. And these are the 3 topics that I'm going to be exploring in the next 20 minutes. So a nice starting point for any account of point of view is to consider the mode of narration. And broadly speaking, we can differentiate between homodiegetic and what we call heterodiegetic narratives and narration. In homodiegetic narration, then, the person telling the story, so the narrator, is a character within that story. We typically see this in first-person narratives and texts, and what this does is it tends to give readers more direct emotional access to speakers, which can invite readerly intimacy, and also it can encourage sympathetic alignment. In a heterodiegetic narration, in contrast, the narrator is outside of the story. We typically see this in third-person texts, and this enables a wider scope for the narration such that different characters can be spotlighted or focalized at different parts of the story. This is not always the case though, as sometimes more limited perspectives can be shown. In something like Harry Potter, for example, the text is told through heterodiegetic third-person narration, but only Harry's perspective is focalized. We aren't actually given access to Snape's thoughts, for example, or told what Dobby is wondering about at a certain point of the story. In this kind of narration, narrators are able to address readers more directly, and that's one of the affordances of heterodeidetic narration. The extra layer or filtering of the narrative, as you can see represented in the distance and the story boundaries that are shown on the diagram on the left of the screen there, this means that narrators are able to create more ironic distance, or perhaps to lay bare some of the mechanisms of storytelling. All three texts that I'll look at here are third-person heterodeidetic accounts, so this one is the one that we'll be focusing on. So let's start then by looking at vantage points. So whose perspective do we share as readers when we read a text, and how is this shown in language? So this scene is from A Room with a View, and this scene is called the Violets scene by literary critics, and it's considered to be one of three pivotal scenes in the novel. It describes the kiss that takes place between George and Lucy while on a day trip in Italy, and it follows Lucy as she walks along the terrace to unexpectedly discover George waiting for her there. It is generally regarded as one of the emotional centres of the novel, in that the symbolism here is heightened. There is an extended metaphor of water, for example, which can be traced through from earlier scenes. If we consider the spatial dimensions of the scene, we can clearly see how readers are aligned with Lucy's spotlighted or focalised physical point of view. In other words, the camera would follow her physical movements through space pretty closely, if we go back to that idea of kind of filming this scene. These spatial dimensions are noted through prepositional phrases, so they're put in bold on the screen here, hopefully you can just see those. So phrases like out of the woods, onto a little open terrace, some 6 feet above from her feet, and so on. These phrases have a deictic function, which means they work to orient Lucy as the centre point of perspective. The deictic alignment is further suggested through phrases which suggest proximity. The demonstrative pronoun this, in this terrace, for instance, suggests close proximal alignment, as compared to, for example, if it were labelled that terrace instead, which would imply greater distance. At the end of the extract, though, there is a shift in point of view whereby George instead forms the focus of the frame. This shift is conferred through the noun phrase change in reference to his character. So Lucy had previously referred to him somewhat vaguely as the good man, but in this final paragraph we move to the first name and the more familiar George. This point of view shift also works spatially. While Lucy's perspective was focused on the eddies of flowers around her as she walked on the terrace, George's focus is on Lucy, and specifically her face and her physical appearance, again marked through prepositions. He describes the radiant joy on her face and the flowers that beat against her dress. Interestingly, the voice of the narrator is not lost within this shift in focalization to George, as the narrator voice is actually still visible, or audible, I guess we should say, with the return to the extended water metaphor, which doesn't quite disappear. References to the blue waves of the flowers continues, for example. This spotlighting of George at the end of this extract has a wider narrative function. Significantly, readers are not given access to Lucy's emotional response to the encounter, to the kiss. And in other words, at this pivotal moment, readers are closed off from more direct access to her thoughts, which becomes even more marked by its absence. And of course, this becomes important later on in the story as well. Okay, so moving on then to an extract from Persuasion and to another aspect of point of view. So Austen is renowned for her use of free and direct discourse and blurring the voice of the narrator with that of a focalised character, as well as many other point of view techniques that she uses across the course of her writing. In Persuasion, the protagonist, Anne, is not given much opportunity to externally verbalise her thoughts to those around her, and instead much of her voice is represented through her thoughts. We can see this dynamic in this extract here, where she talks to her friend Lady Russell about visiting Kellynch Hall, where Anne and her family used to live with her late mother. Even the ratio of direct speech, which is marked in that second sentence through inverted commas, in comparison to the rest of the narration in the extracts, is telling. So the second sentence there is externally vocalised, spoken out loud by Anne to Lady Russell, but the rest of that description is Anne's inner thoughts and how they're represented. So as with Lucy and George in the previous extract, we are closely aligned with Anne's perspective, and proximity of space is suggested through these rooms in the final paragraph, for example. In contrast to the previous extract from A Room with a View, though, readers are given a greater sense of subjectivity in this passage. In other words, we know what Anne is feeling, we know what she's feeling emotionally, and therefore we have access to the psychological dimension of her point of view. Here, this is marked through the prominence of what we call epistemic modality, and by that I mean expressions that relate to knowledge and certainty or lack thereof. Modality occurs through modal verbs like could, should, would, but also in other expressions of subjectivity. Here, there are lots of verbs of cognition, so I think, that appears in her direct speech, and also the verb considered. Modal adverbs like unquestionably, as well as statements of certainty marked through modal statements. For example, in her knowledge that Lady Russell would suffer if she visited the hall. Significantly, there is also some deontic modality in this passage. This occurs in modal expressions that relate to duty or obligation. The phrase, she could have said more, for example, confers her epistemic position, but also her sense of duty, so it wouldn't be appropriate for her to say more at this point, is what she thinks. This, along with the fact that her thoughts and voice attribution in that final paragraph are negated, so it says she had no power of saying to herself, and she gives no sigh, is again significant in the wider themes of the novel, where Anne's voice and her agency as a character is constrained by social duty. Okay, so the final extract then that I've selected is taken from Atonement. And I think because we are talking about point of view, I had to choose the very famous fountain scene, or at least one of the iterations of the fountain scene. So that is this one, as experienced through Bryony's perspective. So in this scene, Bryony looks out of a window and she sees her sister Cecilia and family friend Robbie having an argument by the fountain in the garden. This scene is retold through Cecilia's perspective at another point in the story. So this novel then is known for its use of disnarration. At the end of the text, readers are told that the point of view that we encounter is not actually what at first appears. And so we have to retrospectively repair and revoke the status of the story and the point of view in which it's told. And I've tried to be quite diplomatic in that description just to avoid spoilers. So that's quite a vague description of the plot there. What is interesting here, though, in terms of point of view, is the communication that takes place between the narrator and the reader, which seems to occur over young Bryony's head. So her naive or childlike perspective is first marked through particular schemas. In the earlier parts of the story, she refers to fairy tale templates, and we see those references here. She thinks she is witnessing a rescue and a marriage proposal, something befitting of a fairy tale with princesses. There are clear references to the templates that these kinds of stories have, and this is marked in the references to sequences, rites, and conventions, as marked on the slide there. So a script is kind of being followed here. Tellingly, this also foregrounds the act of storytelling at this early part of the novel. As before, her subjectivity of point of view is marked through modality. Again, mostly through epistemic modals here. What is interesting, though, is the contrast between high certainty and doubt in her point of view. So she notes that she did not understand and has a weak intimation about what's actually happening. But at the same time, there are markers of high certainty in clearly and there could be no doubt. This movement between the two works to create heightened distrust among readers. Even when she's certain, we might ask whether we can really be sure that she is giving an accurate account of things to us. Finally, her subjectivity and reliability is also called into question through the temporal shifts in the narration. The witnessing of the fountain scene is framed as a kind of threshold that Bryony crosses. It notes here, for example, such was Bryony's last thought before she accepted that she did not understand. And then the references to how easy it was to get everything wrong, everything completely wrong, become like a statement given by the older and later Bryony. Bryony's position as an older enactor of herself is mentioned later in the reference to the sizable passage of time that passes, so it says 6 decades later. This temporal shift disrupts the narrative so that when we return to young Bryony at the end of this extract, she becomes distanced and she becomes the young girl who went back to the window. In other words, we remain in the point of view of older Bryony, reflecting on those overlapping memories from a point in the future, which is also spatially removed from young Bryony as represented here in this scene. While these references may not be foregrounded on a first reading of the text, the twist at the end of the novel means that these style choices gain greater salience on a second reading. The exposure of the mechanisms of storytelling is said to create a kind of destabilizing effect in the narration, in that the structures of the story become blurred and conflated. That this scene is told more than once also calls into question to what extent the narrator could be considered cooperative. When narrators avoid telling part of a story, readers tend to give this significance. We might think, for example, of the famous bit in The Great Gatsby where Nick Carraway skips over an event and doesn't talk about it. But I would argue that the opposite is also true. So retelling the same scene more than once similarly foregrounds the events. And then differences between the retellings invites a comparison between the different points of view and also highlights any potential discrepancies that might occur in the storytelling. Okay, so hopefully then these three mini case studies, these three mini analyses have given an overview of how we might be able to explore linguistic style choices in point of view. We can think about the physical parameters of the narration of a scene, but also about more conceptual or psychological ones as well. As these mini analyses have shown, there are certain linguistic choices and mechanisms that might help us to consider how this is done. For example, deixis indicates orientation, as we saw earlier on, and where the narrator might be positioned spatially in the story world. And if we're thinking about physical location, then prepositions might also be helpful to look at. If we're thinking about point of view along the psychological dimension or thinking about subjectivity, this might involve exploring choices of modal verbs and other expressions of modality, or we might consider to what extent the description might be considered specific or vague. And then finally, reliability may be flagged up through a combination of style choices, including temporal disruption, or maybe the over-reporting of particular things that happen in the story. It could also be flagged up through lots of modality or inconsistent modality, and especially uncertainty, as well as other strategies like overt comments on the act of storytelling, as we see throughout Atonement. As we saw in that Atonement analysis, this can create a more direct address between the narrator and the reader, which can sometimes bypass the character and their sort of focalized point of view. Hopefully then, these are just some techniques and ideas that might be helpful to explore, and importantly to show how these style choices and patterns are not just tokenistic features of language, but actually instead meaningful ones, and ones which contribute to wider literary themes and motifs within the broader stories. And I think we'll leave it there. I think that's about 20 minutes. So thank you to SlidesGo for my snazzy slides, and I'm happy to open up the floor for questions.
Thank you, Chloe. So if anyone has any questions, if you want to put them in the chat, or please do put your hand up if you'd like to as well. I'm just going to skip through and have a look. I was really pleased that you spoke about deixis there and modality, Chloe, because I've got a lot to get through in mine, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit about those as well. So you've done some definitions for me, which is really good.
That's helpful. Yeah, I thought there might be a little bit of overlap there, so that's good. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Definitely.
Sorry, could I ask a question?
Definitely. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Hello?
Sorry, Esther.
Oh, you can hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry if I didn't see your
No, it's fine.
I was looking at the other screen. I think we've got
no, it's fine.
People in. Yeah, of course. What was your question?
So thank you so much to both of you for holding this CPD today. I'm just asking, as someone who is not very familiar with stylistics, so I was like really intrigued because I've kind of touched upon it a little bit when looking at English language at A-level during my training year, but I haven't really touched anything since. And I was just wondering, where could I kind of like start with regards to, you know, just looking at stylistics and I suppose using linguistic theories in literature in general?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Esther. So yeah, great question. So I guess there's a couple of places you could start. I guess so having a language background is certainly useful for carrying out the stylistic analysis, because I think stylisticians would probably argue that we are fundamentally and first and foremost linguists. That's kind of what we're interested in. So I think, yeah, you start with well, if you have got a linguistic background, you're quite used to text analysis and language analysis. I guess what we're doing then is sort of treating the literary text like any other type of data in that regard. So taking an extract and kind of starting to have a look at what those foregrounded patterns are. So I think, yeah, there's different ways you can do it, but I would always start with the text, start by looking at the patterns that are there. And then sort of scaling up, as I sort of tried to show in those case studies, really, kind of trying to do that bridge between the sort of literary interpretation side of things and the kind of linguistic patterns, because I mean, hopefully this came across, but there are, you can scale up, you can see how those literary, those broader motifs and themes and those metaphors about, you know, the kind of postmodern theme in atonement and the idea about kind of social constraints and persuasion, they can be traced down to those sort of more micro instances of language. So yeah, start with the language, start by looking at the patterns, and then maybe scale up to see how that kind of coincides with wider literary motifs and themes. And I guess in terms of sort of wider reading and things, I can point you in the direction of some sort of intros to stylistics. Because it does have, you know, there's, as Meg just mentioned, that there's a suite of kind of terms and labels and frameworks and things that we use to help us explore these patterns. So I think, yeah, it can be helpful just to have those to hand. Not that you need to talk about all of them, but just the obvious ones. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I found Paul Simpson's, I think it's Stylistics, a resource book for students. I found that really, really helpful, definitely. So yeah, but there's a lot of different oh, I've got such an echo, sorry. But yeah, sorry, I was just saying there's yeah, I definitely agree. It'd be great to look at kind of an introduction to some of the terms, and it's kind of helpful to have a resource there. I can't see any further hands up, but I'm not sure if I'm missing anyone out again. So please do shout out if you have a question. Can't see anything in the chat for now. I can move on anyway to the next talk, and then we've got a little bit of extra time at the end for questions anyway, because I always seem to overrun anyway, so that's that's probably it
worked out well.
Yeah. So I'll just share my screen, and then if any other questions do occur to you about Chloe's talk there, then feel free to ask them at the end of my talk as well, since they're very related. So okay, so hopefully you can see that. Can everyone see my screen okay? I can't actually see anybody.
Yeah, we can see it, Meg. That's all good.
Yeah, that's all right. Thanks. So I can't actually see anyone when I'm sharing my screen and recording at the same time. So I thought I'd just check. Great. Okay, that's brilliant. So that's all good. If it stops at any point, feel free to shout out and let me know, because again, I might not realise. So great. Okay, so I'm going to be moving on now. So Chloe, having spoken about stylistic approaches to teaching prose. I'm going to be talking about stylistic approaches to teaching poetry. But as you'll see during this talk, a lot of the methods and approaches are interrelated. So I'll be talking about some different things, but also there is, as I said, some overlap there as well. So I just thought I'd begin actually with a little bit of context around teaching poetry at secondary level, which of course you're all aware of the place of poetry at secondary level and its place on the curriculum. But I just wanted to mention this idea and highlight this compartmentalization of language and literature as discrete subjects at GCSE, which can mean sometimes that literary texts and literature can be treated really from Key Stage 3 onwards as separate from language awareness. And what Stylistics hopefully does is it enables us to, in many ways, bridge the two, as Chloe said, and to draw on language awareness in order to facilitate understanding of literature. So I hope to show in my talk today that that's possible to do when it comes to teaching poetry, by, as we do in Stylistics, applying these linguistic frameworks to literary texts. And I want to show as well that using this meta language is enabling and helps to facilitate this process of analysis. And I think that Chloe's already begun to show that with the prose, because of course, as I said, these approaches do interrelate. I also wanted, just in terms of thinking about this context, just to draw on this quotation from Marcello Giovanelli's introduction to this book, Teaching English Language and Literature, 16 to 19, because I think it's quite helpful in just helping to show that compartmentalization. In this chapter then, Marcello quoted from an examiner's report from Educas, where they had said centres should encourage candidates to limit their use of terms taken from English language study, as these often distract from literary analysis. And then Marcello goes on to say, the advice offered here follows a well-established pattern of representing English in secondary and post-16 education. Language and literature are effectively separated. So there is sometimes this perception then that language awareness not only isn't important for understanding literature, but actually that it can be harmful. And again, I want to show, and what Stylistics shows us, is that actually that isn't the case. And what is the case is that language knowledge is enabling, as long as it isn't applied necessarily in this feature spotting way, and in fact is applied as a tool for interpretation. Therefore facilitating analysis. So I wanted to mention that, just really to highlight the context that you are working within, and that sometimes there can be this resistance to language as a way into poetry. And I think it's helpful to be aware of that, really in order to know what you're up against, in a way, in order to think about justifying why we use language as a way in to looking sometimes at a poem. And hopefully I'll show why that can be useful today. So I'm not going to go too much into what Stylistics is, because I think Chloe's covered it already for you. But really it is this idea that linguistic procedures are key to any stylistic approach. And while that sounds quite complicated, really what that means is that language is afforded, according to Simpson, primacy of place. So literature is just a type of language, and we're looking at it in that way. When thinking about poetry as well, I also want to suggest here that initial reading without framing of a poem in terms of context can actually be really helpful. So when I show you the poem that we're going to be looking at, as an exemplification of stylistic analysis in a minute, I'm not going to provide you with the context of that poem. You might know it personally already, which is fine if you do, but I'm not going to provide you with that until after the first reading and analysis. And the reason for that is drawing on some research around the value of holding off sometimes on context and leaving that until a little bit later in order to enable students to develop their own interpretations and draw on their own schematic awareness, rather than being directed to just one particular interpretation. So that's drawing on some research from Giovanelli and Mason, where they discuss how this can allow for authentic reading rather than manufactured reading, where the teacher is essentially directing students to just one interpretation that they are assuming or they are expecting students to take from the text. So if we hold off in terms of context, what that can do is enable us to avoid what Giovanelli and Mason call prefiguring, or really highlighting and focalizing one particular interpretation above all others. So that enables students to understand the breadth of interpretation possible when it comes to looking at a poem, or more broadly a literary text. So after reading a poem for the first time, we will also, after we read the poem rather together, I'll also then introduce to you some different stylistic frameworks to discuss how those can work as a tool for interpretation. So in terms of a process then for stylistic analysis of poetry, one thing I do want to highlight is, while I'm going to be speaking today about different frameworks that you can use, drawn from a language study or linguistic frameworks to analyse a poem, I do want to stress that that doesn't necessarily mean you need to go straight in with those frameworks. So a process for stylistic analysis might involve, as I imagine it probably often does in your classroom anyway, this process of beginning with the text first. So, and then perhaps reading the text with the class and asking them the kinds of general questions that help to elicit those individual interpretations. So how does the poem make you feel, for example, or what is the poem about, who is the speaker, what is it about, why are they speaking to this person, for example, or another quite general question. So the text can come first before then looking at it again using linguistic frameworks in a stylistic approach. So, as I say, as a second step, we look at the language of the text. But this can take place in two different ways. So this might involve either applying a language framework to explore the text, or it also might involve simply identifying features that actually help students explain their answer to the question that you've just asked them, the general question, and then using the language to help explain this. So for instance, how does the poem make you feel, and why might this be in terms of the language? So I suppose what I'm trying to say here is that we don't always have to explicitly apply a language framework. Instead, students might, for example, highlight features of the poem that help explain their response, and then the teacher might work with them to identify how the language is creating that effect. So that is a very valid stylistic approach as well. And in many ways, that's, yeah, it's certainly equally valid and a really great way to approach looking at a poem. But it's probably something that you're more familiar with than the first process, depending on your standpoint and where you're coming from. So I'm going to look at the first approach today. I'm going to introduce some frameworks and think about how they could be used as a lens to look at the poem, rather than the second process, with which you might be more familiar in terms of step two. So the poem we're going to be looking at, as I said, I'm going to introduce this without context, but I will speak about it later. So this is a poem by Alice Dunbar Nelson, and I will speak a little bit about her, as I say, a little later in the presentation. So I'll read the poem just to give you time as well to experience and read the poem. And in case the font is a little bit small, hopefully it's okay as you're looking at it on your own computer. So I'll read the poem, and as I say, with students I might provide them with quite a general question around what the poem might be about or any feelings that they have around it. So I sit and sew. I sit and sew, a useless task it seems, my hands grown tired, my head weighed down with dreams. The panoply of war, the martial tread of men, grim-faced, stern-eyed, gazing beyond the ken of lesser souls, whose eyes have not seen death, nor learned to hold their lives but as a breath. But I must sit and sew. I sit and sew, my heart aches with desire. That pageant terrible, that fiercely pouring fire on wasted fields and writhing grotesque things once men. My soul in pity flings appealing cries, yearning only to go there in that holocaust of hell, those fields of woe. But I must sit and sew. The little useless seam, the idle patch, why dream I here beneath my homely thatch, when there they lie, rather, in sodden mud and rain, pitifully calling me, the quick ones and the slain. You need me, Christ, it is no roseate dream that beckons me, this pretty futile scene, it stifles me. God, must I sit and sew? Okay, so that's the poem, which I chose because I thought it might be one that you may not be familiar with, but as I say, you might be already, in which case you'll have a richer sense of the poem and the context of it. So as I say, firstly, I just talk to students and ask them, and I'm sure this is a process you often follow yourself as well, around initial impressions around a poem, when you're looking at an unseen poem or a poem for the first time with your classes anyway. So giving them a chance to think about their interpretation, what they think it might be about more generally, any feelings, emotions that they feel or might identify within the poem as well. But then what I might do then, after asking these initial questions, so some examples there, I'm sure you can immediately think of several of your own as well though. So after that stage, I might then think about applying some different possible frameworks to the text. So thinking about stylistic frameworks then, I might look, for example, at abstract and concrete nouns within the poem. So I might ask students to use that as a lens through which to examine the construction of meaning in the poem, deixis, verbs, modality, or metaphor, for example. So let's look at a few as an example. I'm covering quite a lot here, so I'm not attempting to give you a really detailed analysis with each. Obviously, with a class, you might spend a whole lesson looking at a poem using just one or two frameworks. I wouldn't just rush through like this, but I just want to introduce you to some different lenses on the text, really. So for example, then, you might ask students to look at and identify, so perhaps highlight in different colours, or list examples of abstract nouns within the poem, and concrete nouns as well. So you might introduce them to the definitions of abstract nouns and concrete nouns, so approaching it from that language-based perspective, before asking them to identify those as a first stage of the process. So discussing what abstract nouns are and concrete nouns first. Obviously that's going to help them as well with their language awareness. But then importantly, in terms of analysing this as a piece of literature, then what you'd want to do is discuss looking at the poem from this perspective of only focusing on some of the nouns here. What do the students actually notice in terms of the different effects, or the different aspects or shades of meaning that are conveyed by the abstract and the concrete nouns? So you might, for instance, discuss with students, or students might therefore be able to identify that actually a lot of these abstract nouns, they are on quite a grand scale, and so therefore they perhaps convey the grand and devastating scale of war, in terms of words like soul and death and hell and lives. Many of them are quite existential, or convey extremely strong emotion, and yet the concrete nouns, by contrast, many of them convey physicality, so the mud and the rain and the fields of war, the men who are experiencing war, or the human body of the speaker, so her hands, her head, for example, or the elements of what she's actually sewing with, so the seam and the patch. So this might help then to convey this idea of war as being something that's quite grand and sweeping and, you know, obviously hugely deeply affecting, but also as existing as something that affects people on an individual scale as well. So in highlighting the smallness there of the speaker and the individual too. And then you could then go further with this and look at the different connotations, of course, of the different nouns that are used to describe the speaker and her actions, and maybe the men as well and their actions too. Or you could even categorize the nouns without even using abstract and concrete nouns. You could look at whether they fit into any other categories that the students decide in order to help facilitate that nuanced language analysis. So Chloe spoke a bit about deixis earlier. Just to recap, it's a word or phrase that points to the time or place or situation in which a speaker is speaking and locates them really in relation to something else. So you also might look at this poem, as I say, using this as a lens through which to examine the construction of meaning. So you might introduce students to this definition. More specifically, you might perhaps discuss spatial deixis, temporal deixis, and you might look at the spatial deixis within this poem. So students might, for instance, identify words like that are repeatedly used to describe the war and the metaphors for the war. So that pageant terrible, that fiercely pouring fire, or words like there and there, that again, and those. And all of these have this quite distancing effect. So suggesting really the speaker's distance as this woman who is sitting at home sewing, suggesting the distance that she has from these from the men away at war and the war itself. So while she describes it as completely horrific, it's also something that's quite far away. And by contrast then, you might look at the proximity that's conveyed in spatial deixis used to describe herself and her own location. So this, for instance, pretty futile seam as she's looking at her sewing, this little useless seam, and I here. So the proximity to these smaller objects like the seam there, for instance, of the speaker, perhaps helps to convey her sense of powerlessness in what she's actually able to do, which is only to sit and sew for the war effort, as compared to these men who are away fighting, for example. So deixis here could provide a really interesting way to help students to identify and discuss some of the ways these meanings are constructed, if they're perhaps not able to get to those immediately without that fine-grained focus on some of the language. You could also look at the verbs. So here's another example. And what I've chosen to do here is not to go through lots of different categorizations of different verbs. You could do, so if you wanted to, you could discuss with students the difference between a stative and a dynamic verb. So a stative, a verb describing a state of being, and a dynamic verb relating to movement or action. So you could discuss that and you could identify the verbs in the poem. Or you could use Halliday's transitivity system, which categorizes verbs as 6 different types of processes. So you could go a lot further than what I'm doing here. But what I'm suggesting here is that you could simply ask students to highlight the verbs in the poem and ask them, what do you notice about the verbs here? And actually, are there any differences in the verbs that are used to describe the speaker and the verbs that tend to be used to describe the soldiers here? So this might enable them to develop an understanding of the different presentation of the speaker as compared to the soldiers that she refers to, or the men she describes. So the verbs to describe her actions are interesting because we have sit and sew, which describe really these kind of very small and minor actions in perhaps the world of her reality. But we also have verbs like flings, yearning, and dream here. Dream is also used as a noun elsewhere in the poem. But at one point it's used as a verb. And there they are used to convey really these imagined actions on a much grander scale. So again, contrasting her powerlessness with what she wishes she could do. And for the soldiers then, we have many verbs really that suggest either helplessness or crying out for help, for example. You might not get that interpretation from the poem, and that's absolutely fine. I'm just giving this as an example. And actually that's the great thing about using a language framework. These are just examples, and students might actually take something quite different from what the task directs them to do, which is what we want, that developing that nuance of interpretation. So briefly then, I'm going to talk about modality as well. So Chloe spoke already about modality today, so linguistic devices that indicate how far something is possible, probable, likely, certain, permitted or prohibited. And she also spoke about deontic modality, which indicates how the world ought to be, so ideas around really obligation and expectations. So in this poem then, you might use modality as a frame through which just to examine the way the poem shifts from no modal, not being modalized at the beginning with I sit and sew, with this development to I must sit and sew, the repetition of I must as well, but then the modality that shifts to a question at the end, must I sit and sew? So perhaps conveying there this increasing frustration really that we seem to get through the poem arising, and then at the end though perhaps a shifting to perhaps the frustration becoming so extreme that the speaker is perhaps considering an alternative course of action. So that's another framework you could use that could be really interesting to look at as well. And finally then, you also might look at metaphors within the poem too. So I haven't by any means written down all of the metaphors within this poem. There's lots and lots of them. And some things that could be interpreted as metaphors as well, and that are perhaps less explicit too. But some of the more explicit ones I've listed here, as well as one which you could see actually as a conceptual metaphor. So even where the speaker says weighed down with dreams, that is a conceptual metaphor. It evokes the conceptual metaphor of happiness being up and sad being down. And conceptual metaphor is this idea from Lakoff and Johnson that we actually use metaphor all the time to conceptualize the world around us. So we use it to explain how we feel about things, to really represent our own experience. And in this case then, being weighed down with dreams suggests the speaker's sadness. So it might be an interesting way to introduce that to students. So to take their kind of knowledge and understanding of metaphor to the next level. Thinking about timing, I haven't really got time to do an extensive analysis here in looking at the metaphor. So I'm just going to point that out. I'm just pointing this out really as an alternative approach. So to say to students, okay, we'll recap what a metaphor is, perhaps depending on their level, and then where can we identify them, but also what effect are they having, and what impression are they giving us of the speaker. So I think this is probably something that perhaps is much more commonly done than perhaps looking at something like Deixis, for example, just because I think teachers speak about metaphors quite a lot, but it doesn't make it any less of a valid approach to look at the poem through that lens. So I just wanted to point that out as well as another example. So the thing about these approaches is none of them is exhaustive, and that's not the point of them. They're all a way of really looking at the text from a different perspective, that then helps us to understand perhaps how meaning is constructed. And just to finish off then with, I did tell you I'd give you a little bit of context at the end here. So Alice Dunbar Nelson then was an American poet, playwright, and journalist, and also a political activist. So she was born in New Orleans, and she was married 3 times with an abusive first marriage. So looking at the poem again with that context, you might like to think about with students, for example, the role of her, or the influence rather of her role as a female living in this time period, and the influence of that on her feelings, for instance, and on the poem itself. And she was also a woman with African American, Anglo, Native American, and Creole heritage, but she identified as Black, and she wrote in essays about her, well, she was really part of the burgeoning Harlem Renaissance movement, and she also wrote about her frustration with not being able to help with the war effort as well. So there's lots and lots of contextual information there. As I say, I think I would not necessarily front load all of this, but instead bring that in after initial impressions of the poem, and perhaps you might like to introduce it and then go back again to stylistic analysis and then think about how this changed or affected students' interpretation of the poem. So that's just an interesting piece of context as well. And also I just found this quotation, which I think was really interesting as well in terms of context of this poem, which is a letter from the Surgeon General of the US Army, which just states that with Black nurses in particular, they were not accepted essentially for service in the Army Nurse Corporation because there were no separate quarters available for them. And he says here, as is not deemed advisable to assign white and coloured nurses to the same posts. So there's a particular element of frustration here, perhaps for Alice Dunbar Nelson, which he did actually write about, not necessarily explicitly quoting this, but wrote about the fact that as a Black woman, she was not able to help as much as she wanted to. So, you know, even though Black male soldiers were involved in the war, Black women were actually excluded from that war effort. So that's a really interesting piece of context as well that might be interesting to discuss with students after reading this poem. However, as I say, I'm really introducing this just out of interest because this poem is an exemplification of the way in which you might use stylistic approaches to teach poetry. So not necessarily this poem, but indeed any other poem that you like, and with the language frameworks you look at depending on the poem you choose. So I did say I was going to run over, and I have, so apologies for that. I'll just skip over this little finally section, because I'm just stating here really that what this enables us to do then is to acknowledge the role of the student, if we then acknowledge the context at the end, but also the role of the author as well in constructing meaning, and acknowledge the transaction between reader and text that exists there. So in conclusion then, if we provide stylistic frameworks to students, it can help to enable comprehension of the mechanisms at work in poetic voice, but also help students to identify ideas themselves, and therefore giving them this tool for examination of how meanings are created as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I've got some time for questions. And apologies for slightly rushing that at the end. I think I was a little bit ambitious in how much I could get through there.